This is the second in a series of videos on using multiples in equity valuation. If you haven't already seen the first part of this series, you should consider doing so first, because that gives you a general and useful overview of what is going on with multiples valuations processes. There are three questions that you need to deal with in order to get your context exactly right with PE multiple valuations. The first of those is to identify which PE ratio, the trailing or the forward, also known as the leading or the lagging PE ratio. The second identification is to decide which multiple you are going to be using as your benchmark, a comparable or a fundamental. And the third identification is to specify whether you are doing a relative or intrinsic valuation. Those three pairs of options create 8 different possible PE valuation permutations. You could, for example, have a relative valuation using a comparable trailing PE, or an intrinsic valuation using a fundamental forward PE. The first of those identification decisions: are you using a trailing or a forward PE? The equations for those are on the screen, and note that both versions of PE have exactly the same numerator. The number above the line in both cases is the current market price of the share that you are evaluating. They differ in terms of the denominator. The trailing PE ratio has historical, most recent period earnings below the line, and the forward PE ratio has a projection of the next period's earnings below the line. Whether you use trailing or forward earnings, you need to normalize those earnings. That is a process which is dealt with in detail in your reading, but in summary, you need to ensure comparability. The second decision that you need to deal with is to establish whether you are using a comparable or a fundamental multiplier. If you're using a comparable PE ratio, then your first step is to identify a valid peer group of comparable companies. You need to calculate an appropriate average PE from your peer group, with the proviso that you need to watch out for outliers. Outliers mean that some numbers just look unrealistic, they look invalid, they look as though there may be errors, and your mitigation response, if there are outliers, include removing those outliers and then calculating an arithmetic mean, or leaving the outliers in, and if you believe that there are both large and small outliers, then calculate a median, because it mitigates for the existence of both large and small outliers. Or if you identify that the only possibly invalid numbers are the large ones, therefore you only have large outliers, then calculate the harmonic mean of your peer group of PE ratios. The harmonic mean mitigates for large outliers, but it is still affected by small outliers. We are still with the second decision, using a comparable or fundamental PE. If you're using the fundamental PE, then you need to apply one of those two equations as is relevant to your identification that you're working with either forward or trailing PE. The inputs into those equations are exactly the same in terms of R being the required rate of return on equity and G being the growth rate in dividends that you would use in the Gordon growth model. The retention ratio, if you've never seen that before, that is sometimes denoted in other books by the letter B, and it is defined at the bottom of the screen in plain language as the proportion of the company's earnings that it does not pay out as a dividend. Moving on to the third of the identification decisions that we need to make. If you are doing a relative valuation, you need to compare your trailing or forward PE with your comparable or fundamental trailing or forward PE. You then reach a conclusion as to whether that share is overvalued, undervalued, or approximately fairly valued by the market. And if necessary, you make an investment decision, which would be to sell, buy, or hold. In the previous video, I discussed the differences in relative valuation and intrinsic valuation. Let us revisit those principles in the context of relative valuation using a PE multiple. Starting with Company A Limited, we have calculated its actual PE using its current market price divided by normalized earnings, either trailing or forward, and we also have calculated the comparable or fundamental PE multiple. That solid blue line against the comparable or fundamental PE represents the justified or the benchmark PE multiple for that particular company. And if its actual PE is higher than that justified PE multiple, then the logical conclusion is that share is overvalued by the market. Company B is approximately fairly valued, and for Company C, we have an actual PE which is below the justified level, and therefore the market has undervalued that company. Turning attention to the intrinsic valuation, if this is your valuation approach, then you use your normalized trailing or forward earnings and you multiply that by your comparable peer group average or your fundamental trailing or forward PE. Having calculated an intrinsic value, you compare that with the current market price and you conclude, once again, overvalued, undervalued, or fairly valued by the market with your investment or analyst recommendation. And the final slide in this video, if a share's current market price is at the level represented by the solid blue line, and we see that its intrinsic, its justified value is above the current market price, then that share has been undervalued by the market. Case B, it's fairly closely valued at the current market price, therefore it would be a hold investment decision. And in case C, we have a situation where the intrinsic value based on a justifiable multiple is lower than where the market has priced that particular share C, and therefore that share has been overvalued by the market, and the investment decision would be to sell.